kind of in the 100,000, going to get into the couple 100,000 range. That's probably a good starting point, and that going up, I think is a good time to have a conversation with someone like us, because at that point you're probably got an employee or two, you're starting to incur costs, you're kind of in that R&D mode, and you can certainly benefit from the program. So it's kind of worthwhile. So I think that's probably a good range.
Question. What is available? Like, do I qualify for this? So you mentioned a bit about R&D, and you mentioned about some of the hurdles, for people to even qualify. So somebody listening to this, and then they want to even work with you, or they want to apply to it, who can apply for it? Hi everyone, Natamar is back with the Raise.com Top Capital Raiser Show, where it's my job to tease out some of the best performing habits, principles, traits, and knowledge from the world's best capital raisers. And so today we have Naren Balakrishnan, who is an expert at assisting companies in getting funding with regards to tax credits. So Naren comes from a 2-decade plus career in the technology industry. He started more as a software engineer, and throughout his career he evolved and became more of a consultant. So at GT, Grant Thornton, he's a partner, and he specializes at focusing on helping people navigate the government programs to get tax credits and navigate tax incentives. So through their suites of compliance programs, tax valuations, and due diligence, he works and assists people to cross that chasm in securing their funding. So Naren, it's fantastic to meet you today.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
No worries. All right, so many people may be asking, how this works, where is it located? So perhaps before we even dive into that, if you could share with the audience a bit about yourself and to the lay person, what you really do and how you can help them.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I do have a number of years of experience in the technology sector. So starting off in sort of traditional sort of software development, software testing, coming out of school. And then about 16 years ago, so it's been a while now, I sort of transitioned to the space that I'm in right now, which is tax incentive, tax credit consulting, as well as other government funding programs. And essentially how this works at a very high level is companies that are Canadian companies that are engaged in R&D activities for the most part, and anything that's sort of innovative, do have the opportunity to access government funding programs to help in their growth, essentially. So you're looking at in the life cycle of a company, there's different ways that you can go about raising money and raising capital. One of the sources that companies definitely should be tapping into right from the get-go is government funding, because it's there for you for that reason, and it's really a nice complement to other funding sources. And so the challenge that companies have often, though, is finding out what those sources are. Do they meet the eligibility criteria? What's involved in the application process? And then once you get through the application process, are you going to be able to satisfy any potential compliance requirements around the program? So while the programs do exist, it's sort of navigating them successfully, which is oftentimes a challenge, right? And so the largest program by far that I've been involved with and our team is involved with is called the SR&ED program. So it stands for Scientific Research and Experimental Development, and it's the Government of Canada's largest tax credit, tax incentive program to incentivize Canadian companies to perform R&D in Canada. And it's a very specific criteria that they have that you need to satisfy in order to qualify. So it's not free money by any means, but it is a large amount of money that is allocated to companies that are doing something innovative. And the whole idea behind the program and other grant programs in Canada is to foster innovation, and they want to see Canadian companies do very well from an economic perspective and a growth perspective, and so they're seen as ways that we can support the ecosystem at large. So that's kind of the, I guess, the in a nutshell, what the landscape looks like and what we do at a very high level.
No, it makes sense. How come it's so difficult, to go through that process? Because I mean, you're an expert, so why do people need an expert like yourself to do to enter into this government program that is supposed to foster innovation and be accessible?
It's a great question. So it's approximately $4 billion in tax credits that are given out each year. So that's a large number. But when you think about the number of companies that potentially want to apply in, they have to have a criteria or a screening criteria, right? Because otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of companies that are going to apply in that may not meet the requirement of what they're looking for. So you're going to have while it is a large amount, you're going to end up in situations where you've allocated so much money, and maybe all of these companies aren't deserving, right? They're not truly meeting the threshold or the notion of what satisfies the criteria around an R&D intensive company, right, or something that meets the criteria of eligibility. So that's where there's a bit of a gatekeeping sort of approach, because they have to be able to sort of distinguish that, right? They have to be able to say, well, okay, this is a company that's truly doing something that's innovative, that's benefiting the economy, that has a potential to scale and grow, and particularly in an industry. So if you think about industries that they're looking at that have longevity, and they want to look at being supporting, right? And so that's kind of the reason behind it. If it was just a case of like, okay, well, you're a company that's incurring costs and you can apply in, ultimately they'd probably run out of funding, right? They'd reach a capacity of how much they could do. So they have to have a mechanism to be able to say, okay, this is a company that meets kind of the specific criteria, and that's where the program comes in, because there has to be a means for both from a technical and financial perspective. So one of the things with the SR&ED program, it's not just a numbers program. So it's not just hey, we've incurred this much cost, let's we're allowed to take advantage of this tax credit. It doesn't work like that. So it's both. So you have to show both. There's a element of this is how much cost we've incurred in a given year, but there's also a technical aspect to it. And so the technical aspect where that comes in is proving what you did meets the criteria. And so there's a specific requirement around technical reporting. So there's project descriptions and summaries that you have to prepare. There's an element of technical documentation that has to be supported, because what happens in a potential audit or review scenario is the government, again, is coming in doing those checks, right? So they can't do it for everybody, like everybody that applies into the program. They just don't have the capabilities to audit everybody, just like they wouldn't with a tax, a personal tax or a corporate tax audit. They just can't. They don't have the manpower to do that. However, they have criteria that they look at when they are looking to audit someone. So it could be, this is a company that's asking for a very significant amount of money. So they want to make sure that that's justified, right? So through the technical documentation, through the activities tracking and everything that the company is doing, if it's a very large number, they want to make sure that it's justified. So that's where the complexity of the program comes in. It's not just a checkbox program. It's a program where you have to make sure that what you're doing is justifiable, it's repeatable, because you can be claiming this credit every year. So it's not a one-time thing. So you want to make sure that you have a process in place, a proper R&D study, I like to say, in place, so that if you're going to be doing this and you're going to be investing each year, you've set yourself up the right way. So that's where the complexity comes in, and that's why you want to have sort of an expert, someone like us helping, because of the nature of the program and how it's distributed.
It makes a lot of sense. And I mean, if somebody was doing it, like I definitely think, and this is even before I even met Naren, I definitely think people should not joke around. Government audits of any type are pretty serious. So yeah, so and to the viewers, don't take it as a joke. It's very very serious. So what would you say to the question, what's available, like, do I qualify for this? So you mentioned a bit about R&D, and you mentioned about some of the hurdles, for people to even qualify. So somebody listening to this, and then they want to even work with you, or they want to apply to it, who can apply for it, and where and who?
That's a great question. Yeah, when it comes to eligibility under the SRNED or SHRED program, the key questions you want to ask yourself are technological uncertainty, right? So the crux of the program is really rooted in technological uncertainty. So what does technological uncertainty mean? Essentially, it's what you have to satisfy is what you're doing, what you're building. It could be a product, it could be a process, it could be a new way of doing something. Either hasn't been done, which means that you're kind of first to market or you're the first one to come up with some sort of a concept like this, or the way in which you're doing it is unique, right? In the sense that there's the end goal might be the same. So you might have a competitor that's doing something very similar in the industry, but how you're going about it. So that journey or that path is not essentially known publicly. So it forces you to have to engage in sort of an experimental process. So the idea is I can go do a Google search. I can't find something in a published paper. I can't talk to somebody that's done this before. There's a novelty to it, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have a competitor. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. Like, there's going to be competitors in every space, but how your competitor is achieving that goal, as long as that's not known and it's proprietary and it's kind of your secret sauce, that's what you're judged on. So there has to be an element of technological uncertainty, which means there's a gap, a hurdle, a risk associated with what you're doing. So the credit is designed to incentivize is for you to take risks, right? So and that's the only way any country is going to innovate, right? Is the idea that you're taking a risk on something and you're generating new knowledge. So they're not so much concerned with, hey, I've developed this cool new product or something at the end of it. It's what have I learned, right? What advances have I made in technology? And it could be in varied fields. So obviously, my background coming from software and I work with a lot of companies in media and technology and things like that, but it's not restricted to that by any means. So we've got clients in manufacturing, food and beverage, pharmaceutical, bioscience. We've got medical doctors that are doing these claims. So it really doesn't matter what industry it is. It's an industry agnostic program. As long as you can show that you're advancing technology in some way and you're attempting to overcome an uncertainty, then you have a good chance of qualifying. That said, is that always obvious? No, right? Because when you're at the onset, when you're doing something, you may not even be aware that what you're doing might be a fit. Sometimes it's obvious because you have something that's patent pending, or you've got a trademark, or you've got something very something that you can publish, or you have a very innovative technology. Sometimes that's not the case, and it's not a requirement. Like, you don't have to have a patent or anything like that. So sometimes there's a fine line between, is this something that's kind of routine and standard, or is this something that is even incrementally, this is something that's pushing the envelope. So that's kind of the test. And so usually how we determine that is through kind of a combination of, kind of a review of what the company has done and having conversations with kind of the key players. It might be a chief, somebody from a technology perspective, some of the leads on the science side, the engineers, and whoever might have an understanding of that development, right? And that's usually where we can come in and assess, like, if we think this qualifies. So that's kind of the key thing: advancement, overcoming an uncertainty, and some element of novelty or innovation, I would say.
Okay. So then we go to in what locations, and before we get to take the lead and answer, we have a lot of people viewing this that own businesses, such as manufacturing, own real estate, or want to acquire the both. So, yeah. So what locations? Is it just Canada, or how does that work?
Yeah, the program that I'm speaking of is a Canadian program. So the SRNED program is very much a Canadian program. They want to foster innovation in Canada. They want the work to be done in Canada. That being said, there are some exceptions. For example, if you had someone on your team that's a Canadian resident that needed to go overseas to do some specific testing, or they needed to go to a different location to do some trialing, there's an allowance for some of that out of Canada time. So maybe just to rewind a little bit, some of the costs that you can claim, essentially the largest cost would be your salaried employees. You could have contractors. They also have to be Canadian. So you can have external people that you're paying to do R&D, as an example, but they have to remain in Canada. Any collaboration that you're doing potentially with universities or research institute, there are programs that you engage with a professor, student. Again, those have to be Canadian universities and things like that you're working with. The one exception is if you're purchasing materials. So sometimes in a manufacturing environment, you have to purchase a very specific material that may not be available in Canada to do your trials. Those types of materials can come from outside of Canada, but that's really the only exception. So everything else has to be Canadian. If you are looking, this is outside of our scope, but if you are, for example, in the US or in other jurisdictions where there is R&D going on, there are similar programs. So if you're a US based company that's doing R&D, for example, in fact, my counterpart at Grant Thornton in the US would be helping companies take advantage of the US R&D program, and similarly in the UK and Australia. So most of the major countries have similar regimes, similar R&D. It's different. It varies in terms of the credit rates and how the program is structured, but there are R&D programs similar to the Canadian program in many countries. So that would be my answer to that is if you are doing something that's not Canadian, but you are potentially doing R&D in other countries, take a look at the programs that might be available there.
Got it. And that being said, if somebody comes and even just hearing this, like when they hear tax credit, does that just mean that they're paying less tax on their profits? Like instead of the 6 to 12 or 13% or whatever it is, they're paying 0% or they're paying half of that. So what does the tax credit look like?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty interesting. So there's two types of credits. I won't go too much into the numbers, but just at a high level, a Canadian company, so what we call a CCPC, which is a Canadian controlled company. So they're either headquartered here or the majority ownership is here or by Canadians. You can access on salary costs, up to about 60% back. So if you had, let's say, $100 in eligible R&D expenditure being incurred by a salaried employee, up to about 60% of that could come back as a tax credit. And what happens is that the way it works is if you are taxable, like you mentioned that too, like if you're a company that's profitable and you are taxable, it will first reduce your taxes. So if you owe a certain amount of tax, these tax credits will reduce that. If you're not, the really nice thing about these credits is they're refundable. So the idea is if you're not in a taxable position, you're actually getting cash back. So you can be incurring these R&D costs, you file an R&D claim, and you're getting cash back each year that you can then reinvest or whatever you choose to do with it. I have a lot of clients actually in this position. They're not profitable yet, but they're making use of these tax credits because they can take that money that they've spent, get a refund back, and then pump that money back into further development or whatever they'd like. So the refundability of them is really key. Being able to you can use them even if you're not taxable. For foreign-owned companies that are not Canadian, you don't get the refundability. So you do, and it's at a lower rate, but you can still benefit from the tax credits if you're taxable in Canada. So that's the distinction. So it is kind of more favorable for a Canadian company, a Canadian controlled company to be accessing these because it's enhanced rate and it's refundable. But we have clients, we have companies that are, for example, US headquartered that set up a subsidiary in Canada that can still take advantage of the tax credit. So that's kind of how the credit works at a high level, and again, up to about 60% on the salary costs will be coming back.
Nice. So, and just to clarify, because an earlier point, you were saying, okay, like if they are not in Canada, then they should just work with the domestic Grant Thornton that's abroad. But you're saying that you can have a foreign company that sets up a subsidiary in Canada that takes advantage of this program, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The distinction is it's Canadian in both cases. It's just kind of the ownership. So it's an entirely controlled Canadian company versus a foreign controlled company. In both cases, you have to be doing the R&D in Canada. It's just that the credit rate varies based on the ownership. The point I made earlier would be for if you don't have, you're just a U.S. company or you're just an international company or you're doing all your employees are in that country, then you'd be better suited to take advantage of the local the tax credit for that country. In fact, we have clients that do both. So we have a client, for example, that's a U.S. company. They do a U.S. R&D. They have a subsidiary. They have a subsidiary in Canada who's also doing R&D. So they take advantage of both credits. So that's the distinction.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So then so we look at the people that see what you're offering. They see we were talking a lot about R&D. How about other programs? Because it seems as if that you're really, this is really something that you're really an expert on. But is it only R&D that people can get these types of programs with, or are there like people that already have cash flowing businesses that are producing cash and then they want to fund growth? Are there programs like that? I'm just curious on the suites of different projects that you can, or I guess programs that you can help with.
Yeah, absolutely. So this tax credit is really for R&D. So that's kind of the purpose behind it. But there are other programs in the Canadian sort of ecosystem, the grant landscape, more on the government grant side. So just a quick just a quick differentiator between sort of what I've been talking about in terms of tax credits and grants. So tax credits, you incur costs, you spend money, and then you get a portion of that back each year when you file your tax return. Grants are more upfront subsidies. So the idea is, okay, there's a program, for example, called IRAP, and it's administered by the National Research Council. So NRC IRAP, what it does, it's similar to SHRED in terms of being an innovation credit, innovation program, but it goes a little bit further. So to your point, Natu, like, it goes a little bit further in terms of commercialization and job creation, and so it's not just focused on the R&D aspects. And that program is a grant. So how that one works is essentially they look at your it's a project based, similar to SHRED. So they look at your project and they say, okay, do we think this is something that adds value to the economy? Do we see this as something that is innovative? And so they'll subsidize upfront. So they'll say we're going to pay 50 to 80% of the cost of an engineer or a series of engineers' salaries in advance of the project being undertaken. And so that's an example of a program that again goes beyond R&D. But it's a grant. So you have to sort of pre-qualify your project. And if they approve your project, you're going to get the funding to work on that project. Similarly, there's a program right now that's open called Can Export. So this is in kind of partnership with Export Canada. Again, it's not an R&D program. So this is, I have a product that I want to take outside of Canada to a new market. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to give you funding to expand. So this could be for marketing. It could be for things like attending trade shows, for translation, for attending business meetings in a new market. So let's say you're a Canadian company and you want to try and get into the U.S. market. This is a very good grant that's designed for that. So there are programs certainly that are not R&D only. They get into, again, export. They get into hiring, training. There's a number of different aspects, and there's kind of what I call scale-up programs. So there's like sustainable development. So as you scale as a company, there certainly could be additional opportunities. And I guess a couple others I will mention is some of them are tied to industry. So the idea is if you're doing something in AI or you're doing something in manufacturing, there might be some more specific programs that are catered towards that. And then the other thing would be if you're doing anything that's focused with university, coming back to that, there could be some good research type programs that are also available. So certainly beyond the R&D scope, there are a lot of programs that are available in Canada for funding.
Got it. Okay, fantastic. So going back to the R&D, some people listening to this podcast, maybe they own a business that does like, $200,000 a year. Some people, $2 million a year. Very few people, maybe $20 million a year. So then who would be the best type of person to approach you for this R&D program? Just so I can get a sense of to what scale should the project be?
Yeah, I mean, I think because there's no real minimums to the programs. There's certainly maximums in terms of not so much that you can't qualify. It's just that once you start to get to very large numbers, the credit rate starts to grind down a little bit. But if we look at sort of the lower end, certainly once you start incurring those costs, it's probably a good time to have a conversation. I think it's just because you don't want to leave money on the table. However, I think, the one thing to kind of consider when you're early on is it too small, right? Is it like you're just starting out and you're just starting to incur those costs? Usually there, it's probably too early. Not only for us, but it's probably too early for companies to start thinking about it because, as I mentioned earlier, right, there's a process. You've got to, get things organized on your end. You're probably going to be working with someone like us. You've got the government involved, so it's kind of bang for your buck, right? Like you don't want to be doing a lot of this if it's the return is very, very small. So I think it's more in the, I think you mentioned it kind of in the 100,000, going to get into the couple 100,000 range. That's probably a good starting point, and that going up, I think is a good time to have a conversation with someone like us because at that point you're probably got an employee or two. You're starting to incur costs. You're kind of in that R&D mode, and you can certainly benefit from the program. So it's kind of worthwhile. So I think that's probably a good range. But yeah, and then when you get very large, what tends to happen is you're probably past R&D mode and you're more into commercialization and you might have raised some funding and the government funding doesn't become as important. Whereas in the earlier stages, this is really a lifeline for a lot of companies. Like these shred credits, like they're essential, I find, for a lot of companies in those first 3, 4, 5 years to kind of keep them afloat, keep them running before they go after sort of the external funding. So I think that's where we would come in typically.
No, that makes sense. It reminds me of just a quick tangent. It reminds me of, in the States you have these companies that they need to get FDA approved, and so they'll be the only type of companies that are pre-revenue that focus on doing these SPACs and IPOs before a cent has been raised, only because of the nature of the regulation. So, do you see anything like that here?
Yeah, there's quite a bit here that I hear, and I know that some companies actually do go to the States sometimes because there's a lot of processes like that, and it is industry dependent. So I think definitely to get something off the ground in medical, if it's like a medical device, we have some clients, it takes years sometimes, right? And just to get that adoption, just to get that approval. So there is similar things happening here in Canada in terms of approvals. The other one I think is got clients that are in kind of space, and sometimes it just takes years when you think about some of the protocols and some of the clearances and things like that you have to get. So these programs, these government programs, are great in that runway, right? Because you're doing a lot of R&D, you're investing a lot of money, but you're maybe not in market yet, you're not profitable yet, you may not even have these approvals yet. So yes, definitely there's a long cycle sometimes. I find it's industry dependent. Sometimes, you're able to get off the ground and get to market pretty fast depending on your industry, but other times it's not the case.
That makes sense. And how are we on time, by the way, on you?
Yeah, I've got a few more minutes. Yeah, sure. If there's any other questions.
Cool. So what I think there there are a lot of people that may be wondering what are some stories of companies that have leveraged the program. The people, you don't have to say the name, but just maybe an idea of like an example of somebody that came to you or came to your company and then they worked with Grant Thornton, they were a success in leveraging the credits, just so that people can see who are the best types of people to emulate and what they did wrong, what they did right.
Yeah, like we've got a lot of different stories, a lot of different industries. I would say what we're seeing a lot of now in the tech sector, it's separated out. So you've got like fintechs, you've got legal techs, you've got ed techs. I think a couple of and then health tech companies. I think over an interesting story would be a company that really over the pandemic they got to market with they were developing sort of the e-health platform. So, because telehealth, and that really took off, especially in the pandemic and post-pandemic, you see a lot of that telehealth platform. And so they were a company that I remember was able to do a lot of development, were able to take advantage of the Shred program. It was funneling that development, and that really sped up their kind of ability to do the development and get to market. And it was sort of critical for them, right? Because when you think about what was happening at the time with COVID and not being able to for doctors to see patients and things like that, and just having this sort of ability to do that over virtual platforms. So I think that was one example of a company that really did take advantage of the program. And I think one of the things that we did for them that when we talked earlier about sort of the complexity around was really identifying that yes, what they were doing fit the criteria, but also kind of a hands-off approach. So obviously at that time and even now, like I think what we find with entrepreneurs is you're really focused, you're really busy, you've got your day to day. So what we're able to do in our process is kind of offload a lot of that, the documentation and the work that you have to do to get these credits. We're able to come in and say, okay, you focus on your day to day business and what you're trying to do, and we can take this piece and save you a lot of time and make the process efficient, right? And so that's what we were able to do for them. Is so just to make sure that make sure we're maximizing what they were entitled to, but also putting all the paperwork and putting all the backup behind it. So they were luckily, I don't believe they were audited, which also speaks to the fact that when you put in a solid application, it sort of satisfies the screening criteria, and you may not get audited. So that's part of our goal. But if they were to get audited, we felt that we were in a good position to be able to defend their claim as well. So that's one of, I guess, many stories that I that we would have, but that's one that sort of comes to mind around a client that I had that took advantage.
Nice, amazing. It's almost like what we do at raises.com to help people prepare their real estate deals in the free, I guess, the free market there. Just reimagine it for leveraging tax credits from the Canadian government and potential grants. And he's kind of like operating like a fractional expert that just comes in, or probably full time even, like comes into your company and takes care of that. So, I guess as we close, what would you say if there's one thing that if people should remember from this talk? What would it be, or from you in general and what you represent at Grant Thornton? What would it be?
Yeah, I would say, making government funding a part of your journey is really key. So I would say there are companies that I've heard this from companies saying, oh, this is a lot of work for us, and is it going to be really worthwhile for us to do this? Is it something that we should look into? And they sometimes don't take advantage of what's available. I would say that's a mistake. I think you want to take a look at all sources when you're in your company, especially in the early stages when there's not a lot of funding. And I think it's even more paramount now with what we're seeing. A lot of the external funding has dried up, right? There's been challenges obviously in the last couple of years. So this is where it's even more critical to look at alternative sources, right? So when I know in the pandemic there was a lot of money raised, but since then we've seen that kind of drop down, and especially in Canada, right? I don't know in the States. I know there's a lot of money that's still flowing, but in Canada, these programs are actually very good, and they stack up quite favorably to other programs. I have some familiarity with some of the other R&D programs and other funding programs in other countries. Canada's program, and especially the R&D program, is very, very lucrative. So it's something that you want to take advantage of. And I think, and then the second point to that is you probably want to ensure that you're doing it properly. And so that's where we come in, because what can happen is if in a given year you do this and say it's a sizable claim and the government comes in and let's say they were to deny your claim, and that could set you back, because then it's kind of an uphill battle for subsequent years, right? So making sure you are doing things properly is also key. So that's what I would say as kind of a takeaway from this is make sure you're taking advantage of these programs, but also make sure that you have a good partner in doing them.
Oh yeah, take this principle, everyone watching, and apply it to even if you work with another firm or another sector, apply it to your own situation. This applies to securities, tax, and everything. But if you're looking for grants, or sorry, not even grants, I guess more like tax incentives, and potentially grants. Naren is here. So Naren, if somebody wants to work with you, where should they reach out and how do they get in touch?
Yeah, a couple of ways would be my LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there on LinkedIn, so you can link in with me and you can connect that way through a message. We've got, I think we can make the email. My email contact would be probably the easiest. So always, always something that I'm checking and can be accessed. So those would be a couple. If there's an opportunity to share any resources, naturally, I'm happy to do that as well, either through our website or other materials that we have around the programs. I'm happy to make those available. So that's probably the easiest way.
Fantastic. This will be in the show notes, folks. So everybody, listen. This has been Naren with Grant Thornton, helping people get access to tax credits and potential grants. So Naren, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Nash. It was great.
Cheers.